There are different ways that scientific researchers study mental illness. The first way is through biological explanations in the body. This approach examines biology, mostly of the brain, to find causal links between chemical and genetic processes and mental disorders. These graphics depict biological ways of thinking about mental illness. Biological explanations of mental illness are founded on the assumption that mental illnesses are caused by internal processes of the body and brain. These approaches argue that there are strict boundaries between normal and abnormal behaviors. For example, natural serotonin reuptake inhibitors should block a certain amount of serotonin from being reabsorbed by presynaptic nerve endings in order for the brain to be considered working normally. Psychological explanations of mental illness assume that the mind or psyche of individuals finds causal relationships between their thought processes and mental disorders. This approach to understanding mental illness examines internal processes of the mind and also argues that strict objective boundaries between normal and abnormal behaviors exist. For example, the mind of someone who is convinced that they are the son or daughter of God is not working normally. Finally, sociological explanations of mental illness are based on the assumption that the distinction between normal and abnormal moods, thoughts, and behaviors is not objective, obvious, or even permanent. Researchers using this approach focus on how certain behaviors become labeled as disorders. They also examine social patterns and who is more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness. Sociological research on mental illness examines how different life events, for example, the loss of a loved one, a child moving out, incarceration, or divorce, and chronic social strains, such as discrimination or poverty, impact the onset of behaviors associated with mental disorders, like anxiety, depression, hallucinations. Often these relationships vary across societies and even within a single society. Sociologists examine social patterns that influence mental disorders. For example, after retirement, men in the U.S. are more likely to become depressed. This is not true for women in the U.S. This gender difference is likely due to social rather than solely biological or psychological factors. Men's increased risk of depression following retirement is likely due to social expectations and processes of socialization that leads them to view their economic contributions to the family and workplace accomplishments as more central to their self-worth than women tend to. When men lose this source of self-worth, their likelihood of developing depression increases. This might not be true for more egalitarian societies, where women and men spend similar amounts of time working inside and outside of the home, and where men have more of an opportunity to build their self-worth based on their contributions to the family through care work. Another social pattern of mental health is the characteristics of those more likely to have a mental disorder. Research shows that those with lower socioeconomic status, low wealth and income, women, racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and unmarried people are all more likely to have some form of mental illness. Many scholars argue that individuals that face more prejudice and discrimination in their life are at higher risk for some types of mental illness. Research has also shown that what is labeled a mental illness changes over time and reflects the values of the current culture. In the late 1800s, there was widespread media coverage of hysteria that was affecting women. Women were thought to be crazy for expressing emotions or dissatisfaction with their role in society. Remedies for this mental disorder included pills and sometimes institutionalization. In the modern industrial world, more and more human behaviors are being diagnosed as medical problems. Sociologists call this process medicalization. Medicalization refers to the social process of defining specific behaviors as being a medical condition, when these behaviors were not previously considered to be. For instance, halitosis, or chronic bad breath, childbirth, and the explosion of new forms of addictions are all examples of things that used to be considered normal human behaviors that are now treated as medical conditions in need of medical intervention. Only a century ago in the U.S., alcoholism and addiction were viewed as moral failings. Sufferers were assumed to be weak-willed or of bad character. Today, alcoholism and other addictions are viewed as at least hereditary diseases, at least partially out of an individual's control. There's been an increased faith in the science of medicine and a growing expectation that problems faced by human beings can be addressed by pharmaceutical drugs. A recent trend in pharmaceutical intervention is based on diagnosing men with low testosterone. There's been an explosion of commercials on television advertising how men can fix their medical problems of not having enough testosterone in their bodies. This implies that there is a normal amount of testosterone that men need that is constant with age. Note that most of these commercials are aimed at older men, yet testosterone levels in men tend to naturally decrease with age. Here we have pharmaceutical companies claiming that naturally low levels of older men are unnatural and that their testosterone levels need to be restored to normal levels.